Welcome viewers to the Personal Injury Law Show. This is a show that looks at all things that relate to personal injury law. With me tonight I've got Alice O'Kane, who's been on the show quite a few times. Good evening, Alice.
Good evening, Tony.
And a special guest is Greg Barnes, who's a practising barrister at law and also National President of the Australian Lawyers Alliance. Good evening, Greg.
Good evening.
And who's been on the show in the past. What we're going to talk about tonight is the hot topic of detainees and workers in these detention centres. But before that, I want to go to an article that was in the paper earlier this year about the complaints of abuse and mistreatment by staff at the Melbourne Detention Centre, where there was 187 grievances lodged in 15 months to March 25 last year. And in that period, there was only one person disciplined. Greg, what's your take on this?
Well, I think that's extraordinary. And the problem with detention centres, immigration detention centres, is they're out of sight, out of mind for the vast majority of Australians, and politicians would prefer it to stay that way because it's a hot political topic. The fact that there really is no genuine system in these centres where people can make complaints and have those complaints heard against staff, or even staff against management, I think is indicative of the fact that it's Rafferty's rules in these detention centres.
Alice, it's sad that Greg's talking about out of mind, out of sight. We're talking about people that don't have any status.
That's right, Tony, and I really agree with Greg on this topic. It is an out of sight, out of mind sort of thing. It's very rare that you hear anything about what's going on inside or around a detention centre. And those numbers are astonishing, that they had that many complaints in 15 months. And these staff are also looking after a whole lot of people who have no status in relation to our country. So it's a real worry what's going on.
Well, in fact, Alice, it's worse than that because they don't have any status in this country and they've got no status outside this country. So it's doubly problematic for them.
Well, you do have people. In fact, I'm acting for a couple of young men at the moment who are in the Darwin Detention Centre. They are stateless. In other words, they can't be sent back to their country because to do so would mean that they would face persecution, but it's not a sufficient level of persecution, the government says, for them to get refugee status. So they are in limbo forever and a day, and it's the most appalling situation. And as I say, you'd read it in a Kafka novel and believe it, but you shouldn't be believing it in relation to a liberal democratic society in 2011.
Well, Greg, just on this...
What are we now? 2012.
2012.
I'm getting old.
This particular detention centre in Melbourne, apparently in one of the other articles I read, is probably worse than life in a prison, which is bizarre, isn't it?
That is bizarre. That is bizarre and very worrying.
I want to go to the famous case of S&M and a Secretary of the Department of Immigration. Greg, can you give us the facts of those cases?
Well, this is
the landmark cases.
Yeah, this is a famous case that was heard by Justice Paul Finn, who was probably one of the best federal court judges of recent years. It was heard in Adelaide, I think back in 2005, involved two detainees who are in the notorious Baxter Detention Centre in essentially the South Australian desert. And they had very complex mental health needs. They were essentially, to put it in the vernacular, going mad where they were. They sought their treatment was inadequate. The Commonwealth tried to argue, oh, well, we've outsourced that to a company, so it's the company's responsibility. And what Justice Paul Finn said in a landmark decision, which interestingly the Commonwealth didn't appeal because I think it was unappealable, was to say, look, you're the people who are effectively the jailers, if you were. He didn't use that term, but effectively you're the jailers. You can't then say, oh, well, it's not my responsibility for those I jail or those I detain. And that you've got a duty of care that you owe to all the detainees for their mental and physical well-being.
Greg, just on that, can I stop you? Alice, the court effectively said that the Commonwealth's got a non-delegable duty of care. What does that mean? That's
right, Tony. That a non-delegable duty of care is a duty of care that you can't pass off to someone else and that you do bear the burden for 100% of the time. So you can't just say, well, I've organised another company or I've organised a third party to arrange this, so therefore it's not my fault. I've done what I can. And I think Justice Finn used the words culpable neglect during that case in relation to the treatment of the detainees.
Well, they essentially handballed the treatment of the detainees to a particular psychiatrist, and by all accounts, it wasn't proper treatment anyway, Greg.
Well, it wasn't proper treatment, and in the end, I think what happened to these two people was that they ended up in a state facility in South Australia. But what it showed, I think, was a culture in the immigration system of buck passing. And a culture where, and I think Alice was talking about it earlier, where you've got a situation where it's out of sight, out of mind. You've got people who think they're relatively unaccountable, and I think when you do these cases, and I've had a look at some of these cases, what you find when you get into discovery is that there are an extraordinary number of emails and memos that float around saying action must be taken in respect of certain detainees. It goes up the chain and nothing happens to that person because no one wants to accept responsibility.
Alice, it's surprising that this case, it was very, very detailed, and they're almost trying to deny that these fellows had any serious psychological injuries.
That's right, Tony. And look, as Greg was saying before, that treatment was inadequate. There was a lot of going up the chain and back down the chain, and there's so much passing of responsibility that nothing gets done because everybody's too busy consulting everybody else about what should be done. And it's a real shame because not only is it out of sight, out of mind, it's defective in and of itself.
What's tragic also is the fact that you've got people that can't speak proper English, Greg. You've got people that aren't educated?
Yeah, I mean, most detainees, English is a second language, if they speak English at all. In fact, I recently acted in Perth for a detainee in a case seeking refugee status who had no English, or very little English, and that's common. And so they're a very vulnerable system. In some ways, they're more vulnerable than prisoners in the prison system because they're much less aware of their rights.
So you'd imagine that the majority of these people that don't know what's going on and they're left in the dark, they'd have a psychological problem, wouldn't they, Alice?
That's right, because all they know is that something's not right, but they don't know what recourse they have to get it fixed or how they should be treated in the beginning.
I want to keep moving here, Greg. Tell me a bit about the Cornelia Rao and Alvarez cases that are probably they're the most tragic of all cases.
Well, these are two cases that had a very high profile because these were two women, Cornelia Rao, I think originally from Germany, and Mrs Alvarez, I think from the Philippines, who were effectively detained illegally for long periods of time. In the case of Cornelia Rao, almost 2 years.
Well, she was a citizen.
And she was shunted around the system with severe mental illness. They ended up receiving compensation payouts, substantial compensation payouts.
Well, she got 2.4 million, Alice.
That's a lot of money.
It's probably the biggest one I'm aware of.
They were subject to very, very good reports by former police commissioners Mick Palmer and Neil Comrie.
Yes.
And again, they shone the light on the system. But what concerns me is that we haven't learnt.
Okay. And in fact, after those two decisions, there were some significant payouts to 247 other people. Just after the break, what we're going to do is we're going to go to a bit of a film clip and we can comment about it. So we've got to go to a sponsors break now. So viewers, please stay tuned. Don't go away. Watch this film clip just after the break. Thank you.